All right. I've heard. I'm sure you've all heard about the report. Well, maybe not all of you, but some of you have heard the report about Kim Jong Il sudden disappearance. And if you don't know who Kim Jong Un is, I'm sorry. I think I said Kim Jong Il at the first, but it's Kim Jong Un. He's if you don't know who that is the guy who's the in charge of North Korea. He's called the supreme. The narrative being that he's the supreme leader of North Korea. Um, so, anyways, now there's been talk of that he may be dead, and it's being reported by several countries that who are suggesting that he might be dead. Most prominently being the most prominent point being that he had Kim Jong Un been alive and healthy enough, he would have been at the national holiday of the birthday of the founder of North Korea. Um, and so this and it's and the feeds are saying that Kim Jong Un went in for a heart surgery for a stint, and something may have gone wrong, and it been might have been botched, and so ever since then he's disappeared. And this has been several weeks now that he has Kim Jong Un has basically disappeared. Has disappeared from the political scene in North Korea. Um, uh, Now, this is really concerning. I've done videos about how since Obama's period of the pivot to Asia, or pivot to the Pacific, or whatever the hell you want to call it, the buildup of the naval military in the South China Seas. There's also been the buildup of naval forces in the Sea of Japan, and as well as in the um, Yellow Sea, which is which is connects with the Japanese waters, and where the peninsula, because the Korean Peninsula and Japan are not that far apart, and they share waters around there. So along with that, and it's and moves against Iran, um, as well as the push by the West, and particularly the U.S., into India to get political allies there, and so on and so forth. Then was the reports of moving in new missile systems into South Korea, and and so on and so forth, uh, as well as moving more northerly in South Korea of U.S. military bases, getting it putting it closer to the DMZ, uh, the demarcation zone, the line that separates North and South Korea. uh, and then you have more recent reports, and the ramping up of the threats, which they call saber rattling, with China. uh, as well as the calling China economic saboteurs, saying China is uh, saying China, it's the Chinese virus. Then you have Tempool, and you also have saying China's trying to kill us, and they're stealing U.S. and Western technology. The old adding in the old with the new. Then you have Bill Maher, who's basically doing the same thing. Calling at the China virus and trying to and doing a bad job of it. But there's also a very real element of threatening saber rattling from Bill Maher. Um, you have all this going on and everything else, and now King Jong Un King Jong Un maybe is being reported to be possibly dead or incapacitated, and so all of this you have to understand some base knowledge of history, what went on. So Japan. Okay, so let me give you a quick rundown. Uh, Before World War II had officially kicked off, Japan had basically annexed the Korean Peninsula. They had with military invasion. They had taken a lot of land and territory that was predominant by what a lot of Westerners who really don't make any distinction about what's an Asian. Basically, it went on for which is Orientals, which is basically it's not really all that accurate. Uh, so uh, so and it also included large portions of China. The Japanese had invaded, and they were absolutely brutal, viciously brutal. They killed a lot of people. So and history says Japanese were allies of the Germans. It wasn't really an alliance. It was more of more of uh, a thing of convenience. Japanese weren't really allied with the Germans. What they had done is they said, well, basically they had an agreement with Germany that the Germans could have these parts, and the Japanese would have these parts. That's basically what the West has dubbed as an alliance, uh, and that there would be no aggression between the empire that the Japanese were building and the empire that the Germans wanted to build. Uh, it was actually done fairly logical. The Japanese would take mostly those areas that were on their were on their side of the regional areas, and those who were the West and those basically of the white nations basically if they were Asian, then it was what the Western or white civilization considered Asians. Then it was basically Japan's realm. Um and there was some negotiation for other parts that were not white or Asian. Um, but and of course, Russia was another factor. The Chinese were busy fighting each other and fighting the Japanese. So they were a complete clusterfuck during the time of the Second World War. Um, and so part of what happened in China was that, rather than unifying and rather than viewing the Japanese and the Germans and the Allies as a threat, they they were too busy. Too busy killing each other. Uh, the in China in China though was viewed to be part of the alliance, but didn't really get any support. They were pretty much left alone to deal with the catastrophe that was happening in China, which is what actually brought the Communist Party into life, because Russia was sending over material for sending over material while sending over material during the Second World War, and later on it became Russia supplying the arms and helping to supply the arms and other stuff for the communists, and then the West supplying for the Chiang Kai-shek, the puppet of the West. Um, so at the end of now backtracking a little, at the end of the Second World War, when Japan had lost all the territory that it had gained, and Japan had gained a huge amount of territory, um, which included the Philippines, the Marshall Islands. Basically, they were in Indochina, which is like Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and all those other places. Uh, 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 Japanese are taking a huge swath of stuff of territories around the Western Pacific Rim. Uh, so at the end, it was the alliance who basically split up arbitrarily. The territory in Europe, uh, but more so, they did this again. They did this to Korea and much of the territory that was now had been quote unquote uh, you know uh, liberated from the Japanese, uh, and that only caused more chaos. Uh, it's a form of what the U.S. Has been doing in Central America and South America. They and what they did in China with Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek. Um, they would pick the most dictatorial and vicious and completely unethical person they could find, and to become the dictatorial leader, which they called democracy. They did the same thing in South Korea, and the reason why the Korean War started was basically the there were people who sided with, hey, we're tired on the Korean Peninsula, we're tired of constantly being invaded, being and having our food and our resources and our land and our houses and all that other stuff from foreign powers, basically, and our people under control of foreign powers, whether it's China, whether it's Japan, whatnot. And they so there was a side that said, no, fuck it, all we're gonna take our country, we're gonna solidify it, and so on and so forth. And then you had Sigmund Reed, who was who had been who was more buddy with the Japanese, and then with the U.S. and Western powers, and so the North getting military equipment and funding from Russia, but Russia wasn't sending any troops. And later on, so no, I'm getting too far ahead. So what ended up happening was the North, those who wanted to take back control of the Korean Peninsula and the Korean people as a whole, and basically set up a government and a land that basically said, we are strong, and no more of you outsiders coming in and fucking just doing whatever the fuck you want and killing us wholesale. So, of course, that was all the U.S. and the Allies needed, is because at that time Russia had become instead of an ally, it had become the one of the winners of the allied allied forces that now had become the the un had become the potential enemy of the West. And so the that was so having getting military equipment and some funding, as well as training, that was enough of an excuse. And of course, they had to do the communist bit. North are communists, and so on and so forth. They're socialists. So that was all they needed, but that wasn't the intention. The U.S. wanted political and economic control, and the U.S. and the West wanted political and economic control, much like how they had the British had gotten political and economic control when they with the U.S. and other Western powers and allies had basically forced China to give up Hong Kong and a lot of territory in from China, so that they could have get economic and other controls. So what this was is it was an excuse to try to get political and economic control, and be able to station military presence to so that they could dictate what happens in China, and what happens because there's a direct route into the territories of Russia and China if you take over the Korean Peninsula. That's not what ended up happening, which is why we have the 38 parallel, because China and Russia want the North as a bulwark, a period where they can, if if an invasion by the West would happen, they would have some time to put up a defense and give an earlier alarm on what's going if there was a potential for aggression. So if you're following all this, this means that with and China and Russia have kept the Un family in charge because during the Korean War, the China sent millions of its citizens to help fight on the Korean Peninsula because the U.S. and the West were sending in hundreds of thousands and thousands of them of their military force and equipment into the Korean Peninsula because the North almost the Northern forces alone, the Northern Koreans alone, almost took over the Korean Peninsula. They almost won. The U.S. And the West had barely a tiny foothold, and they were almost pushed out. Um, so, so understand if 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 there is a destabilization of leadership, and I'm not saying I like Kim Jong Un, nor am I rooting for China or Russia, but I'm certainly not rooting for the U.S. And what I want is a unified Korea and one that takes away some of that stupidity in the Korean culture, particularly the misogynistic aspect, and also the much of because there was a lot of cultural and social idiocy in the Korean Peninsula, which allowed them to be the the bitch boys and girls of other powers. There was a lot of hedonistic and other crap that happened, and 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 basically it was just a whole bunch of weak, pathetic people who were in power. These cowards and they didn't have two brain cells to rub together, which is why and they infected that into the Korean people, and they kept the Korean people in in a serf like position, and basically made it so that people couldn't really survive all that well. With obviously there would had to be a smaller portion of the Korean public that did have plenty, but the larger portion didn't. So understand what this means is that there is a possibility that there will be action by the West to try and take political control through a puppet and be able to put more military forces in the Korean Peninsula, and and that way there could be a uh, projected military force to try to cow China and Russia into doing what into doing what the U.S. wants done. So keep this in mind, and 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 be ready for it, because if news starts coming out that China is moving military forces closer to the North Korean border or doing military maneuvers uh, in the North at the North Korean border near the North Korean borders, and if you start hearing about about news from South Korea that involves Western style interests, then there is a high potential for a hot war, and while Americans won't be impacted physically, uh, but economically and all that other stuff that will and socially that those will be the ramifications. And of course, if that's the case, then there will be a drive for recruiting for military. So if so if we suddenly see a hard sell for military recruitment here in the U.S., and it's mashing up with greater and greater saber rattling, then we may be seeing another one of the Iraq sort of build up to the war, to the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, and then and as we know that it bled into Syria, Libya, and all these other places, Afghanistan. Understand there's a high potential for that, but unlike what's happening in the Middle East. Going to a hot war, or just trying to take the entirety of the Korean Peninsula will have drastic costs, and possibly even a world war. And if that happens, those living on the U.S. mainland and or North America, we won't we will see hostil hostility, and so anyways, that's that.